Further operations. A Pompeian success. As already explained, Aetolia, Acarnania, and Amphilochia had been occupied for us by Calvisius Sabinus and Cassius Longinus. I now thought that we should push on a little farther and attempt to occupy Achaia. I therefore sent Fufius Calenus into that area and instructed Sabinus and Cassius to join him with their cohorts. Rutilius Lupus was Pompey's commander in Achaia, and when he heard of the approach of my forces, he prepared to defend the isthmus so as to keep Calenus out of his province. Calenus, meanwhile, received the voluntary submission of Delphi, Thebes, and Orchomenus. He took other cities by storm, and sent envoys to the rest in an attempt to win them over to our side. He was thus fully occupied with these and other matters. While these operations were continuing in Achaia and at Durazzo, the news arrived that Scipio had appeared in Macedonia. I had not forgotten my original determination to come to a peaceful understanding, and so I sent to Scipio our mutual friend Aulus Clodius. Clodius had originally been introduced to me by means of a recommendation from Scipio, and I counted him among my intimate friends. I now gave him a letter and verbal messages to take to Scipio. They may be summarized as follows. I have done everything possible to reach a settlement, but with no success. I attribute this failure to the fault of those whom I have used as intermediaries. They were afraid to bring my proposals to Pompey's notice at what they considered the wrong moment. You, on the other hand, can speak with your own authority. You can not only say freely what you think right, but can even, to some extent, force your own opinions on Pompey, and exercise some restraint on him if he is in the wrong. In fact, since you command your army in your own right, and not as a subordinate of his, you have physical force as well as moral authority on your side. Now, if you could use your influence as I suggest, you and you alone would be gratefully acknowledged by all to have saved Italy from disruption. Clodius gave Scipio this message, and for a few days it looked as though the proposals were being well received. But later he was given no further opportunity of speaking to Scipio, and returned to me without having effected anything. After the war was over, we discovered that Favonius had bitterly opposed Scipio, and that this had been the reason for the change in his attitude. At Durazzo, in order to pen in Pompey's cavalry and keep them from foraging, I had constructed strong defense works across two approaches which, as already stated, were very narrow, and had built forts at both points. After a few days, when Pompey realized that his cavalry were no better off than before, he brought them back again by sea to the main position behind his entrenchments. There was extreme shortage of fodder, so much so that they fed their horses on leaves stripped from the trees, and on the pounded-up roots of young reeds. They had already used up all the crops planted inside their lines, and had to import fodder from Corfu and Acarnania, which meant a long sea voyage. Even so, they still had not enough, and had to supplement their rations with barley. In these ways they managed to keep their horses alive, but finally there was no more barley, or any other kind of fodder left. All the grass had been cut, all the trees stripped of their leaves. The half-starved horses were weakening, and Pompey decided that somehow or other he must try to break out. Among my cavalry officers were two Allobrogian brothers, Raucillus and Agus, sons of Adbuculus, who had been chief of the tribe for many years. They were excellent soldiers, and had done outstandingly good work for me in all my campaigns in Gaul. In return, I had given them important official positions in their own country, had arranged for them to be members of the council of their tribe before they were, strictly speaking, eligible for this honor, had given them land in Gaul confiscated from the enemy, together with large sums of money, and had, in fact, raised them up from poverty to wealth. Because of their fine soldierly qualities, they were not only highly thought of by me, but were generally popular throughout the army. However, my friendship and a kind of native arrogance of their own went to their heads, They began to look down on their own countrymen, embezzled the men's pay, and sent all the booty, which should have been distributed, back to their own homes. The men were enraged by this, and came to see me in a body to complain openly of how they had been treated. In addition to other charges made against the brothers, they accused them of sending in false returns of the numbers of the cavalry and appropriating the extra pay for themselves. In my view, this was not the time for taking severe measures. I was prepared to overlook much in consideration of their past services, and so I postponed any inquiry into the charges. Privately, however, I reprimanded them for having tried to make money out of their own men. I told them that they could rely on my friendship for everything, and asked them to judge their future prospects by thinking of what I had done for them in the past. Nevertheless, the whole affair made them generally disliked and despised, and they were made aware of this not only by complaints heard everywhere, but also by the attitude of their own people, and by the effects of their own guilty consciences. This feeling of guilt, and perhaps also a suspicion that they had not been acquitted, but only reserved for punishment at a later date, made them decide to desert me and try their luck at making new friends elsewhere. They discussed their plans with those few of their personal retainers to whom they dared to admit the crime that they proposed to perpetrate, and first of all, as was discovered after the war was over, plotted to kill Gaius Volusenus, our cavalry commander, so that they should be able to give the impression of having done something for Pompey before deserting to him. But as they got no opportunity to commit this murder, they decided that it was too difficult, and after borrowing all the money they could lay their hands on, ostensibly in order to pay back to their own men the sums of which they had been defrauded, they bought up a number of horses, and with those who were their accomplices, went over to Pompey. They were men from good families, and they were splendidly equipped in every way. They had a large company with them, and numerous horses. They had a fine reputation as soldiers, and had held a high place in my estimation. Moreover, the desertion itself was something quite new and unprecedented. For all these reasons, Pompey escorted them around his defence works, from post to post, and showed them to his men. For up to this time not a single man, whether from the infantry or the cavalry, had left me and gone over to Pompey, though nearly every day deserters from Pompey came over to me, and indeed there were mass desertions of the troops that had been raised by Pompey in Epirus and Aetolia, and other districts occupied by me. But Raucillus and Agus were well informed about everything. They knew what parts of our defences were still unfinished, and what sectors were considered by military experts to be the weakest ones. They knew the times at which guards were changed, and the distances between one post and another, and being able to judge the character or efficiency of the various officers in charge of each sector, they could tell what parts of the line would be best guarded. All this information they passed on to Pompey. As has been pointed out above, Pompey had already decided on trying to break out, and now, with this new intelligence in his hands, he ordered his men to make wicker-work coverings for their helmets, and to collect material for filling in trenches. When this was done, he embarked by night a great number of light troops and archers, and all the material that had been collected on small boats and merchant ships, and about midnight led 60 cohorts drawn from his largest camp and the forts in its proximity down to our lines of fortifications at the point where they were nearest the sea and farthest from our main camp. He sent to the same sector the ships which, as already mentioned, were carrying the material and light troops, and also the warships that he had at Durazzo. All his commanders had been given full instructions as to what to do. I had placed in command of this sector my quaestor, Lentulus Marcellinus, with the 9th Legion, and, as his health was bad, had sent Fulvius Posthumus to assist him. The position was defended from direct enemy attack by a ditch, 15 feet wide, and a rampart 10 feet high, and 10 feet across the top. About 200 yards behind this line, and facing in the opposite direction, was another rampart, not quite so high as the first one. I had had this double line of defences made here because for some time I had been apprehensive about our being outflanked from the sea, and I wanted us to have means of defence if we were attacked from 2 directions at once. But our works were on such a scale, we had a circuit of 16 miles to fortify, and there was so much to be done every day that we had not had time to complete the defences here. The cross rampart facing the sea and connecting the 2 other ramparts had not yet been finished. Pompey had been informed of this by the Allobrogian deserters. Their information did us much harm. We had 2 cohorts on sentry duty by the sea, and it was here that Pompey's troops suddenly appeared at dawn. The soldiers were carried around on their ships and began to hurl their weapons at the southern rampart, and to fill up the ditch with the material they had brought. At the same time, Pompey's legionaries from the land were assaulting the northern fortification. Ladders were brought up, and artillery and missiles of all kinds were used to terrify the defenders. Archers seemed to be pouring in arrows from every side. The only weapons available to our men were stones, and the enemy were well protected against these by the wickerwork coverings on their helmets. Then, just when we were hard-pressed all around, and only standing our ground with difficulty, the enemy observed the weak point in our defences that has already been mentioned. They disembarked troops in the gap between the 2 ramparts where the fortifications had not been finished, attacked our men from the rear on both ramparts, drove them down, and forced them to take to flight. Informed of this sudden attack, Marcellinus sent out from his camp several cohorts to help our men in their difficulties, but they found them already in flight. Their appearance had no effect in steadying them, and they were not able to stand up to the enemy's attack themselves. Additional reinforcements also were infected by the panic of those already in flight, and merely added to the confusion, making the situation more dangerous still, since the very numbers of men involved made a retreat more difficult. In this battle one of our standard-bearers, seriously wounded and his strength failing him, caught sight of some of our cavalry, and cried out to them, "I have guarded this eagle faithfully for many years of my life, and in the same faithfulness I give it back to Caesar, now that I am dying. Take it and carry it to him safely. Do not, I beg you, let it be lost. That would be a disgrace that none of Caesar's armies has ever suffered." So the eagle was saved, but every centurion of the first cohort was killed except the senior centurion of the second squad. Now, after a great slaughter of our men, Pompey's troops were approaching the camp of Marcellinus, where the remaining cohorts awaited them in a state of considerable terror. But news of the battle had reached Mark Antony, who was in command of the nearest fort, and at this point he could be seen with 12 cohorts marching down from the higher ground. His arrival checked Pompey's men and put fresh heart into ours, so that they recovered from their panic. Soon afterwards I arrived myself with some cohorts that I had withdrawn from various outposts. I had received the news by means of the old method of sending smoke signals from one fort to another. I was informed of our losses and discovered that Pompey had broken through our lines and was building a fortified camp near the sea. This would allow him to forage as he liked, and also to keep a point to which his ships could sail freely. My own plans had miscarried. I therefore changed my strategy and ordered our men to fortify a camp close to that of Pompey. The entrenchment had been finished when my scouts observed that behind the wood there were some cohorts, apparently in the strength of a legion, being led into the old camp. By the old camp I mean the one that had been made some days previously, at the time that the 9th Legion, as already described, had engaged Pompey's troops and then attempted to blockade them. The camp bordered on a wood and was about 300 yards from the sea. Afterward, various reasons had induced me to alter my plans. I had moved camp a little way from this original position, and, a few days later, Pompey had occupied the old camp. Since he intended to bring several legions into it, he built larger lines of fortifications all around, leaving the original fortifications intact, like a citadel or strong point inside a bigger fortress. He also dug from the left corner of his camp a line of entrenchments about 400 yards long, running down to the river, so that his men could get water easily and safely. However, he also, for reasons which need not be mentioned here, had changed his plans and moved from this position. So for some days the camp had remained unoccupied, though the fortifications were still in a good state of repair. Now my scouts informed me that the standards of 1 legion had been carried into this camp. This had also been observed from some of our forts on the higher ground. The position was about 500 yards from the new camp that Pompey had just made. I was anxious to make up for the losses we had suffered that day, and I saw here a chance of being able to surprise and destroy Pompey's legion. I left behind 2 cohorts to give the impression that we were still working on our fortifications, and then marched out myself with as much secrecy as possible, by a route which appeared to lead away from our objective. I had with me the remaining cohorts, 33 in all, which included the 9th Legion, though this unit was below strength and had lost many of its centurions. Marching in 2 lines abreast, we made for Pompey's legion in the old camp. My original idea proved to be a sound one. We arrived before Pompey could know of it, and though the defences of the camp covered a wide area on the left wing, which I commanded myself, our rapid attack drove the defenders down from the rampart. At the gates, which were barricaded with studded beams, the fighting lasted for a little time as our men tried to break in and the enemy fought back to save their camp. In this engagement, Titus Pulio, the man who, as already mentioned, had been responsible for the betrayal of Gaius Antonius's army, fought magnificently. However, our men's courage was irresistible. They broke through the barricade and first forced their way into the larger camp. Next, they broke into the smaller fortification within the larger camp, to which the defeated legion had retreated. Here they met with some resistance and inflicted a number of casualties. But fortune, powerful enough everywhere, plays a particularly important part in war. The slightest tilting of the scale can lead to a complete reversal of a situation, as happened on this occasion. It has already been mentioned that there was a line of entrenchments extending from the camp to the river. Now the cohorts of my right wing, not knowing the layout of the place, mistook these entrenchments for the fortifications of the camp, and went along them looking for a gate. When they found that these lines merely connected the camp with the river, they pulled down a section of them, and, meeting with no resistance, crossed over. All our cavalry followed them. These operations had taken some time, and by now Pompey had been informed of what was happening. He withdrew 5 legions from their work on his defences and led them to the rescue. At the same moment his cavalry drew near ours, and his line of infantry, formed up in order of battle, became visible to those of our men who had occupied the camp. The whole situation was transformed. Pompey's legion inside the camp took heart again at the prospect of being speedily relieved, stood firm at the western gate, and even counter-attacked. My cavalry, which was climbing up by a narrow track over the earthworks, feared that they would be cut off from retreat, and set the example of running away. My right wing, cut off as it was from the left, saw the panic of the cavalry, and fearing that they might be caught inside the defences, began to retreat through the gap in the rampart which they had made. Some of them, afraid of being crushed in the narrow opening, jumped down from the 10-foot rampart into the trench beneath and were trampled to death by others who tried to make their way to safety over their bodies. And the men on the left wing, seeing from the rampart Pompey approaching and their own comrades running away, were frightened of being cut off in an enclosed space with the enemy both inside and outside the fortifications. They therefore tried to look after themselves by retreating along the same way as they had come. It was a state of utter confusion, panic, and terror. So much so that... Note: there must here be a gap in the manuscripts. It appears that Caesar is now outside the camp, and is attempting to rally his cavalry on the right wing. When I seized hold of the standards carried by the fugitives, and ordered them to stand firm, some rushed straight on at a gallop, others just dropped the standards in terror. Not a single man halted. The position was so desperate that the whole army might well have been destroyed. What helped us and saved us was that Pompey for some little time did not venture to bring his troops up to the rampart. I imagine that this was because he was afraid of an ambush, since everything had happened so unexpectedly, and only a short time before he had seen his men in full flight from their camp. And at the same time his cavalry were slowed because the way into the entrenchment was narrow and also occupied by our troops. So small things often have great consequences, consequences that can turn, as it were, in both directions. For instance, these entrenchments from the camp to the river first of all caused me to miss a victory which, once Pompey's camp had been stormed, was virtually in my hands, and then, by slowing the speed of Pompey's pursuit, saved us from annihilation. In these two battles, fought on the same day, I lost 960 men from the legions, 200 cavalry, including Tutacanus, a Gaul whose father belonged to the governing body of his tribe, Gaius Phleginus of Piacenza, Aulus Granius of Puteoli, and Marcus Sacrativia of Capua, many senior officers and 32 centurions. The majority of these were not killed in the fighting, but perished in the trenches and at the defence works, and by the banks of the river, trampled to death in the panic-stricken flight of their own comrades. 32 standards were lost. After the battle, Pompey was acclaimed as Imperator. He kept the title, and afterward allowed himself to be addressed by it, but he did not as a rule use it in signing his letters, and he did not have laurel twined round his fasces. Labienus had asked Pompey to be allowed to deal with the prisoners, and had his request granted. He was a traitor himself, and no doubt wished to give an example of how traitors can be trusted. After having the men brought forward and paraded, and after addressing them as comrades in arms, he went on to cover them with insults, asking whether it was usual for veterans to run away, and then had them killed with all his troops looking on. These successes had such an effect on the spirit and confidence of Pompey's army that they gave up thinking about strategy in the belief that they had won the war already. It did not occur to them to reflect on the real causes of our defeat, which were as follows. We had been at a disadvantage, both as regards numbers and position. Space for maneuver was restricted by their having occupied the camp ahead of us. We had suffered from 2 outbreaks of panic, both inside and outside the fortifications, and our army had been split into 2 parts, so that one could not come to the help of the other. They also failed to notice that no pitched battle had been fought with the 2 sides meeting in regular encounter, and that the losses which we had suffered were the result not so much of enemy action as of our own numbers and the confined space. Finally, they chose to forget the part that can always be played in warfare by chance, and how frequently it has happened that great disasters have resulted from trifling causes. A suspicion that proves ill-founded, a sudden attack of fear, a religious scruple, and how often an army has come to grief because of the incompetence of its general or a mere mistake made by one of its officers. Instead, they behaved as though they had been victorious because of their own fighting qualities, and as though their fortune could never change. They sent out reports and dispatches all over the world, proclaiming the victory they won on this day. Finding that my original plan had ended in failure, I realized that I must adopt an entirely new strategy. I withdrew all garrisons from the forts simultaneously, gave up the idea of the siege, and bringing the army together in one place, addressed the troops as follows. I do not want you to be too much depressed by what has happened, or to be frightened of the future. Think of the many victories you have won, and set them against this one not very important defeat. You have plenty of reasons for giving thanks to fortune. Think, for instance, of your bloodless conquest of Italy, of how you subdued the 2 provinces of Spain, though you were opposed by people well known for their fighting qualities and by first-rate generals. think of how you gained control of the two main areas from which we get our grain. And finally, you should remember how fortune helped you when you were all brought across the sea safely through the middle of the enemy's fleets, and with enemy forces occupying not only the harbours but the whole coastline. Now, if everything has not turned out successfully, it is up to you to do your own part and help fortune to help you. As for the defeat which you have just suffered, you can blame it on anyone you like, but not on me. I led you into a good position for fighting, and together we captured the enemy camp, drove them out of it, and beat them in fighting. Victory was ours already. What prevented us from grasping it may have been a lack of resolution on your part, a mistake made by someone, or simply some stroke of fortune. Whatever it may have been, you must now do all you can to wipe out this loss by your own courage and gallantry. Do this, and you will find the same thing happening as happened at Gergovia. Defeat will turn to victory, and the cowards of yesterday will be the heroes of tomorrow. After this speech had been delivered to the troops, I had a number of standard-bearers publicly disgraced by being deprived of their rank. But in the army as a whole, there was such a feeling of distress because of the defeat, and such a determination to wipe out the disgrace, that everyone, by way of punishing himself, went out of his way to look for more work to do without waiting for orders from officers or centurions. They were all burning with the desire to fight, and indeed there were a number of senior officers who were so impressed that they thought we ought to stay where we were and risk everything on a pitched battle. I, on the other hand, had not sufficient confidence in troops who had recently been in a state of panic. I thought it better to give them time in which to recover their morale. And I was also extremely anxious about the grain supply, now that we had abandoned our lines. So I waited no longer than was necessary for looking after the sick and wounded, and then, with as little disturbance as possible, at nightfall, sent all the baggage ahead to Apollonius, with orders not to stop to rest until the journey had been completed. I sent one legion to guard the baggage. Once this operation was over, I kept 2 legions in camp and sent the rest by different gates out along the same road at about 3 a.m. Then, after a short interval, since I wanted the news of our departure to reach the enemy as late as possible, but at the same time wished to keep to the normal military procedure, I ordered the signal to be sounded for breaking camp, and immediately set out after the rear guard. Before long, we were out of sight. Once Pompey discovered our plan, he wasted no time in coming after us. His aim was to catch up with our army on the march while it was still in a state of terror and confusion, and so he led his legions out of camp and sent his cavalry on ahead to slow down our rear guard. However, he was unable to overtake us. We were marching light and had got too far ahead. His cavalry only caught up with the rear guard when we had reached the Genesis, a river with steep, difficult banks. Here they engaged us. I sent my own cavalry to oppose them, together with 400 light-armed shock troops who fought alongside the cavalry. They did so well that, after joining battle with Pompey's horsemen, they entirely routed them, killed quite a number, and rejoined the rest of the column without suffering any losses. The crossing of the Genesis completed the march for the day. We established ourselves in our old camp at Asparagium, and I kept all troops inside the rampart. I sent out detachments of cavalry to get fodder, but ordered them to return without delay by the far gate. Pompey, too, at the end of his day's march, occupied his old camp at Asparagium. His soldiers had no work to do because the fortifications were still intact. Some went off to a considerable distance to fetch wood and fodder. Others, since their last camp was not far away, stacked their arms in the tents, left the rampart, and went back to fetch articles of equipment and personal luggage, much of which had been left behind when it was suddenly decided to depart. They were thus in no condition for continuing the pursuit. I had imagined that this would happen, and about midday I gave the order to march, and led the army out of camp. We went about 8 miles, twice the distance covered on the first day. As his men had gone away, Pompey was unable to follow our example. Next day I followed the same plan as at first, sending the baggage ahead at nightfall and following with the legions at about 3 a.m. I did this so that if I were forced to fight, I could meet the emergency with an army already prepared for action. I adopted the same procedure on the following days, and in this way it happened that, in spite of the deep rivers we had to cross and the difficulties of the routes, we sustained no damage at all. Pompey was handicapped by the delay on the first day, and, though on the following days, in his desire to overtake us, he made his men press on by forced marches, all this labour was in vain. By the 4th day, he gave up the pursuit and realized that he would have to adopt some other plan. The move into Thessaly. A number of reasons made it necessary for me to go to Apollonia. Arrangements had to be made for the wounded. The troops had to be paid. Our allies needed encouragement, and garrisons had to be left in some of the cities. But I dealt with these matters as quickly as possible, since I was in a hurry. I was anxious about Domitius, and feared that Pompey might be upon him before he realized what was happening. So I was extremely eager to join him, and marched toward him with all the speed possible. I was basing my whole plan of campaign on the following considerations. 1. If Pompey followed us, he would be drawn away from the sea and cut off from the supplies which he had at Durazzo, and so would be forced to fight us on equal terms. 2. If Pompey crossed to Italy, I would combine forces with Domitius and march by way of Illyrium to Italy's relief. 3. If Pompey tried to take Apollonia and Paleocastro, so as to cut us off entirely from the coast, then I would move against Scipio, and Pompey would be forced to come to the aid of one of his own armies. So I sent messengers on ahead to Domitius with letters informing him of what I wanted done. Then, after leaving garrisons of 4 cohorts at Apollonia, 1 at Lissus, and 3 at Paleocastro, and having seen that the wounded were billeted in various places, I began to march through Epirus and Aphamania. Pompey guessed what my plan was, and decided to move also in the direction of Scipio. If I marched against Scipio, then he would go to his assistance, and if I, while waiting for legions and cavalry from Italy, preferred to stay near the coast in the neighbourhood of Paleocastro, then he would attack Domitius in full force. Each of us realized how important it was to move quickly. Each had another army of his own to help, and each wanted to be in a position to deliver a crushing blow should the opportunity present itself. But I had to leave the direct route in order to go to Apollonia, while Pompey had an easy journey into Macedonia by way of Candavia. Another unfortunate thing had happened too, quite unexpectedly. For some days Domitius had been camping close to Scipio, but now, in order to get supplies, he had moved away from him and gone to Monastir. Fate itself seemed to have thrown him directly in Pompey's path. At the time, however, I did not know this. After the battle at Durazzo, Pompey had sent dispatches into all the provinces and to all the native states, giving a much more highly coloured picture of his success than was justified by the facts. The report had spread that I was in flight after having been defeated with the loss of almost my entire army, and because of this rumour, the roads were unsafe, and a number of states were changing from my side to Pompey's. As a result, messengers sent by me to Domitius, and by Domitius to me, though travelling by a number of different routes, always failed to get through. However, some Allobroges, friends of Raucillus and Agus, who, as already mentioned, had deserted to Pompey, happened to meet some of Domitius's scouts on the road. Perhaps they found it natural to get into conversation, since they had been in many campaigns together in Gaul. Or perhaps they were carried away by the thought of their successes. In any case, they gave a full account of what had happened, and told Domitius's men that I was on my way, and that Pompey was very nearly there. Domitius, when he received this information, had less than 4 hours in which to get away, but thanks to the kindness of the enemy, he succeeded in doing so, and joined forces with me as I was on the way to the town of Iconium on the Thessalian frontier. Now that our armies were united, I went on to Gomphi, which is the first town in Thessaly that one reaches on the road from Epirus. A few months previously, the people of this place had sent a deputation to me of their own accord, offering to put themselves at my disposal and asking me to send a garrison. But the greatly exaggerated rumors about the Battle of Durazzo, which I have already mentioned, had reached the town before me. Androsthenes, the governor of Thessaly, preferred to share in Pompey's victory than to join me in defeat, and so he ordered in from the country the whole population, slaves and freemen, shut the gates, and sent messengers to Scipio and to Pompey, asking them to come to his assistance. So long as help came quickly, he said, he could rely on the fortifications, but he would not be able to stand out against a long siege. Scipio, after learning that the armies had left Durazzo, had marched to Larissa. Pompey had not yet reached Thessaly. As soon as I had fortified a camp, I ordered scaling ladders, sheds, and hurdles to be got ready for an immediate assault. When these orders had been carried out, I spoke to the troops, pointing out to them that to gain possession of a rich and well-stocked town was just what we needed to relieve our difficulties of supply, that at the same time the example of this town would strike terror into the rest, and that the operation must be carried out quickly before reinforcements could arrive. The soldiers showed a wonderful spirit, and I made full use of it. We began the attack at about 4 p.m. on the day of our arrival, and in spite of the high walls, we took the town by storm before sunset. I gave it over to the soldiers to plunder, then moved camp immediately and marched on Metropolis, where we arrived before any news or any rumor had been heard of the storming of Gomphi. The people of Metropolis had also heard the rumors about Durazzo, and at first they followed the same policy as the others, shutting the gates and manning the walls with armed men. However, I had prisoners brought out in front of the wall, and when they learned from them what had happened at Gomphi, they opened their gates. I took care to see that the townspeople came to no harm. People contrasted what had happened here with the fate of Gomphi, and every state in Thessaly, except for Larissa, which was occupied by Scipio with large forces, submitted to me, and carried out my instructions. In the country, the crops were now nearly ripe, and finding a good position there, I decided that this was where I would fight the campaign, and here I would await the arrival of Pompey. The Battle of Farsalis. After a few days, Pompey arrived in Thessaly. In an address delivered to the whole army, he thanked his own men for what they had done, and invited Scipio's soldiers to share with them the plunder and the rewards of a victory which was already as good as in their hands. Both armies were brought into one camp, and Pompey shared with Scipio the honors of the command, giving him a special trumpeter and ordering a second tent to be set aside for him as his personal headquarters. Pompey's soldiers had been confident enough before, and now that their strength had been increased by the addition of another great army, they became more confident still. They were surer than ever of the coming victory, and thought that to delay action was merely to postpone their return to Italy. Whenever Pompey took time over his dispositions or acted with caution, they would declare that the whole business could be over and done with in a day, and that the only obstacle to this was Pompey's love of power, and the pleasure he took in treating men of consular and praetorian rank as though they were his servants. Among themselves there were open squabbles about how they should be rewarded, and who should get various priesthoods and official posts. They decided, too, who should hold the consulship for years ahead. Others were putting in claims for the houses and property of those who were in my camp, and there was a particularly violent discussion in their council as to whether Lucilius Hyrus, who had been sent by Pompey to the Parthians, should be allowed to stand for the praetorship at the next elections without being personally present in Rome. His friends begged Pompey to keep the promise that he made to him on his departure, so that it should not look as though Hyrus had relied on his authority in vain, while the others objected that one man should not get the advantage over the rest when the hardships and dangers had been the same for all. There were daily quarrels about who should succeed to the priesthood held by me. The competitors were Domitius, Scipio, and Lentulus Spenther. In the course of their discussions, they could not restrain themselves from using publicly the most insulting language about each other. Lentulus made much of the respect due to his age. Domitius boasted of his popularity and high position in Rome. Scipio relied on his relationship to Pompey. Then Acutius Rufus accused Afranius before Pompey of having betrayed the army during the Spanish campaign. And in a meeting of the council, Domitius proposed that when the war was over, those among them of senatorial rank who had taken part in the campaign should be given 3 voting tablets each for deciding on the fate of those who had remained behind in Rome or had been in towns occupied by Pompey and had not offered their services in the army. 1 tablet, it was proposed, would indicate a complete acquittal, 1 the loss of all civil rights, and 1 the imposition of a fine. Indeed, they were all occupying their time and thoughts on the honours and rewards they were going to receive, and on how they would revenge themselves on their personal enemies. They gave no consideration to the problems of how they were to achieve victory in the first place, or of how they were to use it afterward. Our grain supply was now assured, and the soldiers had regained their strength. Since the battles at Durazzo, enough time had passed for me to be able to feel confident that the morale of the troops was high. I considered that the moment had come to find out whether Pompey intended or was willing to fight a pitched battle. So I led the army out of camp and drew it up in battle formation, first of all in a position favourable to us and at some distance from Pompey's camp, but on the following days, moving farther away from our camp and close up to the hills held by Pompey. This had the effect of making my army become more confident with every day that passed. As to the cavalry, I retained a system of organization which I have already described. In actual cavalry, we were very heavily outnumbered, so I selected a body of young men from among the shock troops who were chosen with a special view to their speed in action and were lightly armed, and made them go into battle fighting side by side with the cavalry. They were given daily practice in this mode of fighting so as to become thoroughly familiar with it. As a result, 1,000 of our cavalry, having gained this experience, were quite prepared to stand up to 7,000 of the enemy, even on open ground, without being seriously disturbed by the disparity in numbers. Even during these days of practice, in fact, we fought 1 successful cavalry engagement, in which we killed, among others, one of the 2 Allobroges, who, as already described, had deserted to Pompey. Pompey invariably drew up his line at the bottom of the hill on which his camp was situated, no doubt hoping that I would expose my troops on unfavourable ground. It looked as though there was no chance of enticing him out to fight a battle, and I came to the conclusion that my best policy was to move camp and to be constantly on the march. By always moving from one place to another, it would be easier to secure our supplies, and at the same time I hoped that we might get an opportunity to engage Pompey on the road, and that by these daily marches we would wear out his troops, who were not accustomed to hard work. After reaching this decision, I gave the signal for moving. The tents had already been struck when it was observed that Pompey's line had advanced rather farther from his rampart than usual, so that it looked as though we could give battle with him on ground that was not unfavourable to us. The head of our marching column was just at the gates of the camp when I called out to the men, "We must put off our journey for the moment and think of fighting, as we have been wanting to do all this time." Now you can fix your thoughts on battle. We shall not easily get another opportunity like this." I then immediately led the army out in fighting order. As we found out afterward, Pompey had been urged to fight by all his friends, and had decided to do so. Indeed, he had stated in a council of war a few days previously that we would be forced to run away even before the two lines met. And as many of those present were surprised at such a statement, he had said, "I realize that it looks as though I am promising you something almost incredible. But listen to the plan I have in mind, and you will go into battle all the more confidently. I have discussed this plan with our cavalry commanders, and they have undertaken to carry it out. What they will do is this. When the two armies draw close together, they will attack Caesar's right wing on its open flank, ride around and encircle his line from the rear, thus throwing his army into confusion and routing the whole force before our troops have even thrown their javelins. In this way we shall finish the war without exposing our legions to any risk, and probably without any casualties at all. Considering our great superiority in cavalry, there is no difficulty in carrying out this plan." He then told them to be ready for battle next day, and urged them, now that they had got the opportunity for fighting, which they had constantly demanded, not to disappoint the high hopes which he and the rest of the senatorial party had of them. Labienus followed him, speaking with contempt of my forces, and in the most laudatory terms of Pompey's strategy. "Do not imagine, Pompey," he said, "that this is the army that conquered Gaul and Germany. This is a subject on which I am well qualified to speak, since I took part personally in all the battles. Only a very small part of that army has survived. A great many, as was bound to happen in so much fighting, have perished. Many others fell victim to the plague last autumn in Italy. Many have gone back to their homes, and many have not crossed over into Greece. You must have heard that whole cohorts have been formed at Brindisi out of men who stayed behind because of ill health. The forces which you see before you have been raised during the last 2 years' recruiting in Cisalpine Gaul, most of them from colonial cities north of the Po, and the flower even of this army has already been destroyed in the 2 battles at Durazzo." After making this speech, he swore an oath not to return to camp unless as a conqueror, and he urged all the others to follow his example. Pompey praised Labienus for what he had said, and took the same oath himself. And so indeed did everyone else, without any hesitation at all. After these transactions, the meeting of the council broke up in a general feeling of confidence and joy. Their thoughts were already dwelling on what they believed a certain victory, for it seemed to them incredible that on such an important matter so experienced a general could raise their hopes without good reason. I went out toward Pompey's camp and observed that his line was drawn up in the following way. On his left wing were the 2 legions, now known as the First and the Third, which, in accordance with a decree of the Senate, I had handed over to him before the beginning of the Civil War. Pompey himself was with these legions. The center of the line was held by Scipio with the legions from Syria. The Cilician legion, together with some Spanish cohorts, which, as has been mentioned, were brought over by Afranius, occupied the right wing. These were the troops which Pompey regarded as the most reliable of all. The rest were posted between the center and the 2 wings. Altogether he had made up the number of 110 cohorts, amounting to 45,000 men, including about 2,000 discharged veterans who had earned special rewards from him in his past campaigns and had now rejoined his service. They were distributed at points along the whole line. 7 other cohorts had been left to guard the camp and various strong points in the neighborhood. His right wing was protected by a stream with steep banks, and he had therefore concentrated all his cavalry, archers, and slingers to cover his left. I followed my usual practice by stationing the 10th Legion on the right wing and the 9th on the left. The 9th had been considerably weakened in the battles of Durazzo, and so I put the 8th next to it, practically forming one legion out of two and giving each orders to support the other. Altogether I had 80 cohorts drawn up in the line, a total of 22,000 men. I had left 7 cohorts to guard the camp. I had put Mark Antony in command of the left wing, Publius Sulla of the right, and Gnaeus Domitius of the centre. I myself took up my position opposite Pompey. As already mentioned, I had observed the enemy dispositions, and I was afraid that my right wing might be outflanked by the great numbers of their cavalry. I therefore hurriedly withdrew individual cohorts from the third line, and formed out of them a fourth line to oppose the enemy's cavalry. I told them what I wanted done, and warned them that it was on them and their courage that the day's victory would depend. I also instructed the third line not to charge until they received the order, and said that I would signal by flag when I wanted them to go into action. In accordance with the custom of war, I addressed some words of encouragement to the army before battle. I reminded them of how I had always and invariably thought of the interests of my men. In particular, I asked them to remember that they had seen with their own eyes how anxious I had been to make peace. There were the conversations initiated through Vatinius, the attempt to deal with Scipio through Aulus Clodius, and the efforts which I had made at Paleocastra to get Libo's permission to send representatives to Pompey. Finally, I told them that I had always wished, whenever possible, to avoid shedding the blood of my soldiers, and that even now I wanted Rome to retain the services of both armies, Pompey's and my own. After these words had been spoken, the men shouted out for battle, burning with eagerness for the fight. It was at this moment that the trumpet gave the signal for action. In my army there was a veteran soldier who had rejoined me, Gaius Crastinus by name, a man of quite outstanding courage. A year previously he had been the senior centurion of the 10th Legion. Now, as the signal for battle was given, he shouted out, "Follow me, old comrades, and give your general the good service you have always given. There is only this one battle to be fought. When we have won it, we shall regain our liberty, and Caesar his proper place in the state." Then, looking back at me, he said, "My Imperator, I shall make you want to thank me today, whether I am alive or dead at the end of it." With these words, he ran forward into battle in front of the rest of the right wing, and about 120 volunteers, all picked men of the same cohort, followed behind him. Between the two lines there was just enough space to allow each army to move into the attack on the double. But Pompey had ordered his men to stand firm and wait for our charge, in this way meeting us when we had lost our original close order. He was said to have adopted this plan on the advice of Gaius Triarius. The idea was that the force of the impact of our initial charge would be diminished, and our line would lose its cohesion. Thus Pompey's soldiers, standing in their correct formations, would be able to move against us when we were in disorder. It was also hoped that our javelins, hurled against men who remained stationary, would have less effect than if these same men were to move forward and hurl their javelins too. At the same time it was thought that our men, with double the distance to run which they had expected, would be tired out and out of breath by the time they came into action. My own view is that this plan of Pompey's had nothing whatever to recommend it. The fact is that there is a kind of quickening of the spirit, a sort of extra zest which is born and implanted in men by nature, and which receives its great stimulus from the ardour with which they go into battle. The duty of a general is to encourage, and not to repress this quality, and our ancestors were perfectly sensible when they established the custom of having trumpets blown all along the line, and of encouraging the whole army to shout out together. They realized that these sounds have a double effect. They frighten the enemy, and they give added confidence to one's own side. As it was, our men, as soon as the signal was given, charge forward with their javelins at the ready, but they noticed that the enemy were not moving forward to meet them. They then showed what they had learned from their training and from the experience gained in previous battles. They checked their speed of their own accord and halted about halfway between the two lines so as not to use up their energy before they reached their objective. After a short pause, they went on again at the double, hurled their javelins, and immediately, as they had been instructed to do, drew their swords. Pompey's men stood up to the attack well. They met the javelins with their shields, took the shock of the charge without breaking ranks, hurled their own javelins, and then began to use their swords. At the same moment, the cavalry on Pompey's left wing all charged together, as they had been told, and the whole mass of archers and slingers came surging around us. Our cavalry could not hold this attack, and were gradually forced back and out of the way. This made Pompey's cavalry press on all the more fiercely. They now began to deploy by squadrons and to sweep around our exposed flank. Observing this, I gave the signal to the 6 cohorts which constituted my 4th line. They went forward immediately to the attack, and fell upon Pompey's cavalry with such violence that not one of the enemy stood up to the charge. The whole lot wheeled around. It was not so much a retreat as a complete rout, in which they galloped off to find safety among the highest hills in the neighborhood. Once the cavalry was out of the way, the archers and slingers, unsupported, abandoned, and defenseless, were slaughtered to a man. In the main line of battle, Pompey's men were still fighting and standing firm, but my cohorts, carrying on their advance, swept around their flank and began to attack them from the rear. It was at this moment that I ordered my 3rd line to charge. Up to this time they had stayed in position and had not been in action. Pompey's men now found themselves attacked by an entirely fresh body of troops, who brought relief to their exhausted comrades. At the same time, others were attacking them from the rear. They were unable to resist. The entire army turned and fled. After seeing the rout of his cavalry and the total demoralization of that part of his forces in which he placed the greatest confidence, Pompey despaired also of the rest, left the battle line, and rode straight to his camp. Here he spoke to the centurions on guard at the Praetorian gate, raising his voice so that the men could hear. "See to the defense of the camp," he said, "and be ready to fight for it, in case things go badly with us. I'm going around to the other gates to say what I can to the guards there." With these words he withdrew to his tent, with little hope as to the final issue, yet still waiting on the event. Now that the enemy had been driven in flight inside their fortifications, I thought that in their present state of terror they should not be allowed a moment's respite. So I called upon my men to make full use of the fortune we had had, and to go on to storm the camp. Though exhausted by the extreme heat, the battle had lasted until midday, they nevertheless showed a spirit that was ready for anything, and willingly obeyed the order. The camp was well defended by the cohorts who had been left on guard, and some Thracian and other foreign auxiliaries fought back even better still. The soldiers who had fled there from the battlefield were both tired out and demoralized. Many of them had thrown away their arms and lost their standards, and their thoughts were more on escape than on defense of the camp, and in fact those who did man the rampart were not able to stand up for very long to the shower of missiles. Worn out and wounded, they left their posts, and then all of them, led by their centurions and officers, fled for safety to the high ground above the camp. Inside Pompey's camp were a number of especially constructed arbours, and much silver plate, all set out, ready for a banquet. The floors of the tents were laid with freshly cut turf, and the tents of Lucius Lentulus and some others were shaded with ivy. There were other signs, too, of excessive luxury and of a complete confidence in victory. In fact, it was easy to see that men who so went out of their way to indulge their appetites unnecessarily could have had no doubt at all about the issue of the day's fighting. Yet these were the men who used to criticize my long-suffering and patient army for living a too easy life, while in fact we were never adequately supplied, even with necessities. When our men were already inside the rampart, Pompey, after removing his marks of rank as imperator, mounted a horse, hurriedly rode out of camp by the rear gate, and without drawing rein, galloped on to Larissa. He did not stop there. After picking up some of his fleeing men, he hurried on as fast as ever, without breaking off his journey by night. He reached the sea with an escort of about 30 cavalry and boarded a grain ship. They say that he constantly complained of how completely he had been deceived, saying that when he considered how the very men whom he had counted upon to give him victory had been the first to run away, it almost looked as though he had been betrayed. After occupying his camp, I urged my men not to spend their time on plunder, and so let slip the opportunity of finishing off the whole campaign. They were ready to do as I asked, and so I began to surround with lines of earthworks the hill to which the enemy had fled. The hill had no water supply, and Pompey's men, seeing that it was a hopeless position, abandoned the summit and began to retire in one body along the ridges in the direction of Larissa. When I saw what they were doing, I split up my forces. I ordered part of them to remain in Pompey's camp, and sent back some to our own camp. Then, with the remaining 4 legions, I marched out, taking a shortcut to intercept the retreating Pompeians. After a march of 4 miles, we formed up in order of battle. The enemy, seeing us there, halted on some high ground. The river flowed through the plain beneath them. It was now almost night, and my men were worn out by all that they had done from break of day. But I appealed to them once again, and by building a line of fortifications between the river and the mountain, we were able to prevent the enemy from coming down to get water by night. Once this had been done, the enemy sent a deputation to discuss terms of surrender. A few men of senatorial rank who had been with them went off individually during the night. At dawn I ordered all the troops on the mountain to come down into the plain and throw down their arms. This they did without raising any objections, and then, with arms outstretched and weeping, they flung themselves to the ground and begged me to spare their lives. I told them to stand up, and, in order to reassure them and to calm their fears, spoke a few words in which I pointed out that it was my nature to be merciful. I spared them all, and asked my own troops not to harm any of them, and to see that their property was not confiscated. After making these arrangements, I ordered the legions from the camp to replace those who had marched out with me, and sent back the latter to have their turn of the rest. On the same day I arrived at Larissa. In this battle no more than 200 men from the ranks were missing on our side, but we lost about 30 centurions, all very fine soldiers. Christinus, who has been mentioned above, was one of them. He died fighting gallantly, killed by a sword thrust in the face. The words which he had spoken as he went into battle proved true indeed, for this was my opinion of him. In that battle, Christinus had fought with absolutely outstanding courage, and I considered that I owed him a great debt of gratitude for his loyal service. Out of Pompey's army it was reckoned that about 15,000 were killed, but more than 24,000 surrendered, including the cohorts which had been on garrison duty, who gave themselves up to Sulla. Many besides fled to the various states and cities in the neighborhood. There were brought to me after the battle 180 captured military standards and 9 eagles. Lucius Domitius, exhausted by fatigue, was killed by our cavalry as he was attempting to escape from the camp to the higher ground. Death of Pompey. Operations in Egypt. At about the time of the battle, Decius Laelius sailed up to Brindisi with his fleet. He seized an island opposite the harbour, as it will be recalled Libo had done previously, and Vatinius, who was in command of Brindisi, acted just as Antony had done before. He had some light craft decked and equipped for his purpose, enticed some of Laelius's ships into the harbour, and in the Narrows captured one quinquereme and 2 smaller vessels that had advanced too far. He also stationed cavalry along the shore to prevent the enemy crews from getting water. But Laelius had the advantage of a better season of the year for naval operations. He brought over supplies of water for his men from Corfu and Durazzo in merchant ships, and kept up his blockade in spite of all difficulties. Neither the disgrace of losing his ships nor the shortage of necessary supplies was enough to make him abandon the island and leave the harbour alone. In fact, he did not do so until the news arrived of the battle that had been fought in Thessaly. At about this time, too, Gaius Cassius came to Sicily with the Syrian, Phoenician, and Cilician fleets. My own naval forces in these waters had been divided into 2 squadrons, one at Bivona under the praetor Publius Sulpicius, the other at Messina under Pomponius. Cassius sailed into Messina before Pomponius had even heard that he was coming. He found him in a state of complete disorganization, with no guards posted, and no one knowing what to do or where to be. So, taking advantage of a high wind, he loaded a number of merchant ships with pine wood, pitch, tow, and other combustible materials, set them on fire, and then let them drift down upon Pomponius's fleet. The result was that he burned all 35 ships, 20 of which were decked. This action caused such dismay in Messina that, though the place was garrisoned by a whole legion, it was held only with difficulty. Indeed, the general opinion was that it would have been lost if it had not been for the fact that just at this moment news of my victory at Farsalis, carried by relays of horsemen, was brought to the town. The news arrived just at the right time, and so Messina was defended. Cassius sailed away next against the fleet of Sulpicius at Bivona. He found our ships moored to the shore, and, using exactly the same methods as at Messina, he sent fire ships against them, again with the help of a favourable wind. Fire broke out at both ends of our line, and 5 ships were burned out. A strong wind was blowing, and the fire began to spread. Some soldiers from the veteran legions, who had been left behind because of illness, and were responsible for guarding the ships, could not endure the disgrace of seeing them lost, and without waiting for orders, went on board, put out from shore, and bore down upon the fleet of Cassius. They captured 2 of his quinqueremes, and sank 2 triremes. Cassius himself was on board one of the 2 quinqueremes, but he got into a boat and escaped. Soon afterward the news arrived of the battle in Thessaly, and this time even the enemy believed it. Previously they had considered it to be a false report spread by friends and agents of my own. Now that the facts were known, Cassius sailed away. After the battle, it seemed to me that I ought, leaving everything else aside, to go after Pompey, wherever he fled, so that he should not have another chance of raising fresh troops and renewing the war. I therefore pushed on as far as possible every day with my cavalry, and ordered 1 legion to follow by shorter marches. At Amphipolis a decree had been published, in Pompey's name, ordering all the young men of the province, whether of Greek or Roman citizenship, to report for military service. It was impossible, however, to say whether this measure of his was designed to allay anxiety and to disguise the fact that he was planning a further flight, or whether he really aimed at holding Macedonia, if he were left alone to do so. In fact, his ship anchored for 1 night at Amphipolis. He summoned to him various members of his party from the town, borrowed money for his immediate expenses, and then, hearing that I was on my way, sailed from there, and after a few days put in at Mytilene. Here he was detained for 2 days by stormy weather, during which time he was joined by a number of other small ships. He then sailed for Cilicia, and after that to Cyprus, where he received news that by general agreement of the people of Antioch, and the Roman citizens who were there as businessmen and merchants, it had been decided to exclude him, if necessary by force, from the city. They had also sent messengers to other members of his party who were said to have fled for refuge to various states in the neighborhood, and had warned them that if they came to Antioch, they would do so at peril of their lives. The same thing had happened at Rhodes to Lucius Lentulus, last year's consul, to Publius Lentulus, also an ex-consul, and to others who were following the flight of Pompey and had arrived at the island. They had been refused permission to enter the harbour or the town, had been officially asked to leave Rhodian waters, and had thus been forced to sail on, though they had intended to put in there. News that I was on my way was already reaching the states and cities in this area. After hearing the reports from Antioch, Pompey gave up the idea of going to Syria. He requisitioned money from the taxation officers and borrowed also from various individuals. He put aboard his ships a large quantity of copper coinage to be used for paying troops, and armed 2,000 slaves, some of whom were conscripted from the establishments of the local businessmen, and others specially selected by their owners as good material. He then set sail and came to Pelusium. It happened that the boy king Ptolemy was at Pelusium with a large army. He was at war with his sister Cleopatra, whom he had driven from the throne a few months earlier by the help of his relatives and friends. Cleopatra's camp was not far distant from that of Ptolemy. Pompey sent to Ptolemy, asking him, in view of the close bonds of friendship and hospitality that there had been between himself and his father, to receive him into Alexandria, and to use his power to protect him in his misfortune. After making this formal request, Pompey's messengers began to speak more freely with the Egyptian king's soldiers, urging them to do their duty to Pompey and not to regard his cause as lost. Among them were a number of Pompey's old soldiers, whom Gabinius had taken over from his army in Syria, and, at the end of his campaign, had left with Ptolemy Auletes, the father of the young king. The whole matter was referred to the king's friends, who, because of his youth, were in actual control of the kingdom. It may be, as they asserted afterwards, that they were really afraid that Pompey might tamper with the loyalty of the royal army and occupy Alexandria and Egypt. Or it may be that they regarded his prospects as hopeless, and acted according to the common rule by which a man's friends become his enemies in adversity. In any case, they gave what appeared to be a friendly and generous reply to Pompey's messengers, and invited him to come and visit the king. Meanwhile, they had their own secret plan. They sent Achillas, the commander of the king's bodyguard, an utterly unscrupulous character, and Lucius Septimius, a Roman officer, to assassinate Pompey. They greeted him in a friendly and respectful manner, and he was all the more inclined to trust them because he had known Septimius before, having served under him as centurion in the pirate war. So, with a few attendants, he was induced to go into a small boat, and there he was murdered by Achillas and Septimius. Lucius Lentulus was also arrested by the king's orders, and put to death in prison. Before this I had arrived in Asia, where I was informed that Titus Ampius had attempted to remove the treasure from the temple of Diana at Ephesus. He had summoned all the senators in the province to act as witnesses of the amount taken, but had been interrupted by the news of my arrival, and had taken to flight. There were thus 2 occasions on which I was able to preserve the treasure at Ephesus. It was also established by a careful investigation of the dates that in the temple of Minerva at Elis, on the day of my victory at Farsalis, a statue of Victory that had stood facing the statue of Minerva turned around of its own accord, so as to face the threshold and main entrance to the temple. On that day, too, at Antioch in Syria, there was twice heard the sound of an army's battle-cry, and the sound of trumpets. It was so loud that the whole population took up arms, and ran to positions on the city walls. The same thing happened at Acre. At Pergamum, the sound of drums was heard from the innermost and most secret parts of the temple, where only the priests are allowed to go, and which are called in Greek the Adita. Also at Trolleys, in the Temple of Victory, where the people had dedicated a statue of myself, there was exhibited a palm tree, which at this very time had shot up through the joints of the paving stones. After staying for a few days in Asia, I heard that Pompey had been seen in Cyprus. Because of his friendly relations with the Egyptian kingdom and other advantages which the place had to offer him, I guessed that he was on his way to Egypt. I therefore set out for Alexandria, and arrived there with the 1 legion that I had ordered to follow me from Thessaly, another which I had recalled from Quintus Fufius, my commander in Achaia, 800 cavalry, 10 warships from Rhodes, and a few from Asia. These 2 legions together only amounted to 3,200 men. The rest, either because of wounds received in the battle, or the hardships of so long a march, had been unable to keep up with the main body. However, I relied on the prestige of our achievements, and had no hesitation in setting out with such a weak force. We should be, I imagined, safe wherever we went. At Alexandria I received the news of Pompey's death. As soon as I landed, I was greeted by the angry shouting of the soldiers whom the king had left to garrison the city, and I saw a great mob rushing toward me. This was because the fasces were being carried in front of me, and the whole crowd considered this to be an infringement of the royal authority. The disturbance was put down, but for several days on end rioting broke out as a result of mass demonstrations, and many of my soldiers were killed in all parts of the city. Seeing how things were, I ordered from Asia other legions which had been formed out of Pompey's army. I myself was unable to move because of the prevailing northwest winds, which at this time make it impossible to get out of Alexandria. Meanwhile, I came to the conclusion that the quarrel between the 2 rulers of Egypt affected the Roman people, and consequently myself as consul. Indeed, I was myself particularly closely concerned with Egypt, since it was during my previous consulship that the alliance had been made between Rome and the elder Ptolemy, an alliance ratified both by law and by a decree of the Senate. I therefore made it known that I wished King Ptolemy and his sister Cleopatra to disband their armies, to appear before me, and to settle their dispute in a legal way, rather than by force of arms. Because of the king's youth, his tutor, a eunuch called Pothinus, was in real control of the kingdom. He began by expressing among his own party his grief and indignation at the idea of the king's being called upon to come and plead his cause. Then, finding accomplices among the king's friends, he secretly withdrew the army from Pelusium and brought it to Alexandria, where he gave supreme command of all forces to the Achilles, whom we have already mentioned. Achilles was promised rewards in the name both of Pothinus and the king, and was told by messenger or by letter what Pothinus wanted him to do. Now, in the will of the late King Ptolemy, the heirs were the elder of the 2 sons and the elder of the 2 daughters. In the same will, Ptolemy called upon the Roman people, in the name of all the gods and in conformance with the treaty he had made at Rome, to see that his last wishes were carried out. 1 copy of the will had been taken by his ambassadors to Rome, to be placed in the treasury, but political disturbances had prevented its being officially deposited there, and so it had been left in the keeping of Pompey. A duplicate copy was left under seal at Alexandria. Just when I was engaged in a consideration of all this, being particularly anxious to act as a friend to both parties in the dispute about the throne, and to settle the question justly by arbitration, I was suddenly faced with the news that the king's army and his whole cavalry force were marching on Alexandria. My own forces were certainly not large enough for me to be able to count on success if we were forced to fight a battle outside the city. All we could do, therefore, was to stay where we were, and wait to see what Achilles intended to do. Nevertheless, I ordered all my troops to stand by, ready for action, and I asked Ptolemy to send to Achilles some of his most influential friends, and to tell him how he wished him to act. The king sent Dioscurides and Serapion, both of whom had been ambassadors at Rome and most trusted counsellors of his father. When they reached Achilles and were brought into his presence, he ordered them to be arrested and put to death without even troubling to listen to them or find out why they had been sent. One of them, after being struck down, was carried away hurriedly by his own people as if he were dead. The other was killed on the spot. After this I took steps to see that I had the king under my own control. In my view, the very name king carried great weight with his subjects, and if hostilities broke out, I wished it to appear that they were not caused by any wish of the king, but were entirely the work of a small gang of criminals. Achilles had an army which, in numbers, quality, and military experience, was very far from being contemptible. There were 20,000 men under arms, most of whom had once served under Gabinius, but had now grown accustomed to Alexandrian life with all its license, had forgotten what was meant by discipline and by the name of Rome, and had married native wives, by whom many of them had children. Their numbers were augmented by men gathered together from the bands of pirates and robbers from Syria, the province of Cilicia, and neighbouring parts. They had also been joined by a number of convicts and exiles. Moreover, Alexandria offered a perfectly safe way of escape to our own slaves. All they had to do was to give in their names and join the Egyptian army. If any of them was afterwards seized upon by his rightful owner, his fellow soldiers would all come together to rescue him. Being all involved in the same sort of guilt, they regarded any violence directed against one of them as a threat to all. It had become a kind of ancient tradition in the Alexandrian army that these troops had the right to demand the execution of the king's favourites, to rob rich men of their property, to make and unmake kings. There were also 2,000 cavalry, and all these troops had had long experience in many wars at Alexandria. They had restored the elder Ptolemy to the throne. They had killed Bibulus's 2 sons. They had fought in many campaigns against the Egyptians. So much for their record and experience in war. Confident in these troops of his, and contemptuous of the small numbers of my own army, Achilles seized Alexandria, except for that part of the town which we already held. In his first attack he tried to break into the palace where I was in residence, but was beaten off by the cohorts which I had posted in the streets. At the same time, fighting broke out in the harbour area. Here the struggle was the hardest of all. Street fighting was going on between scattered bodies of troops in different streets, and simultaneously large numbers of the enemy were trying to get possession of our warships. These included 50 ships which had been sent out as reinforcements to Pompey, and then, after his defeat in Thessaly, had returned to Alexandria. They were all quadriremes or quinquiremes, well equipped and ready for action. In addition to these, there were 22 ships, all decked, which constituted the fleet normally on duty for the defence of the harbour. The enemy realized that if they could gain possession of these ships, I should be left without a fleet, and they, with the harbour and the whole sea in their control, would be able to cut me off from both reinforcements and supplies. Consequently, the fighting was of a most bitter character, as it was bound to be, for the enemy saw in this action the chance of a quick victory, while we knew that our very existence depended on the result. In the end, success was ours. We burned all the ships already mentioned and others that were in the dockyards, because it was impossible to guard so wide an area with the small forces at my disposal. I then immediately embarked some troops and landed them on Pharos. The island of Pharos gives its name to the lighthouse there, an extremely high tower and a wonderful piece of engineering. This island lies opposite the city of Alexandria, and so helps to form the harbour. Previous kings had connected it with the city by a narrow causeway, about 3/4 of a mile long, and built like a bridge resting on piles. On the island there are houses where Egyptians live. In fact, there is a village almost big enough to be called a town. Any ships which go a little off their course, either because of bad weather or careless navigation, are liable to be plundered by the inhabitants, who behave exactly like pirates. Moreover, the entrance to the harbour is so narrow that those who control Pharos can stop any ship from sailing in. It was because I was afraid of such a contingency that, while the enemy were fully engaged in fighting, I landed troops on Pharos, seized the place, and installed a garrison there. In this way I made sure of being able to receive supplies and reinforcements by sea. I had already sent out to all the neighboring provinces asking for reinforcements. In the other parts of the city, each side lost a few men, but the fighting was broken off without either side's having secured a definite advantage or having been driven from its positions. This was natural, considering the narrow space in which the fighting took place. During the night, I took into my defences and strengthened with barricades that area of the town which seemed to me the one that was vitally important to hold. It included a small part of the royal palace where I had originally been given quarters, and an adjoining theatre which took the place of a citadel and commanded the approaches to the harbour and the docks. In the following days I increased the strength of these defences, so as to leave, as it were, a wall between myself and the enemy, and not to be forced to fight unless I chose. Meanwhile, the younger daughter of the late king, hoping that the throne would soon be vacant and that she would occupy it, made her way out of the palace, went over to Achilles, and began to act with him as joint commander. But they very soon began to quarrel about who was actually in control. This led to a great increase in the pay offered to the soldiers, as each party tried to win over the army to its side by greater and greater bounties. While the enemy were occupied in these disputes, Pothinus kept on sending instructions to Achilles, urging him to persevere with his attack and not to lose heart. His messengers were informed against and arrested, and I had Pothinus put to death. This was the beginning of the Alexandrian War.
Thank you for listening to this audio connoisseur production. We are dedicated to bringing the world's finest literature to an audience of discriminating listeners.